So we'll continue this theme of device materials here. And our next talk, you can see the natural extension going from electron and polarization to spin. So Stuart Parkin will put his own spin on the next topic on chiral spin textures. He is with Max Planck Institute, luminaries all around. Delighted to have you.
Well, thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to give this talk. And in this talk, I'd like to tell you something about chiral spin textures. I'm really going to talk mostly about the manipulation of cochiral, Kagome antiferromagnets. I'd like to tell you a little bit about this. So this is just a picture. I moved to Germany 5 years ago, and it took 3.5 years to rebuild the laboratories, and then 3 years to build them. And so you can see here, for example, an experimental hall where we have a highly sophisticated apparatus for making atomically engineered thin film structures. I'm going to show you results from that, but I'm not going to really discuss that at all. So these are some of the people involved in this work. These are some students and postdocs in my institute in Halle. And I'd also like to acknowledge some theoretical contributions from Ingrid Mattig and Oliver Busch and Birger Goebel. And also we started recently a collaboration with Daniel Loss in terms of a variety of topics. So maybe based on Tony's talk yesterday, I wanted to mention, of course, it does take a long time from discovery and fundamental physics to application. And in my own field of spintronics, I want to just comment on two. There are two important applications today of spintronics, which basically involves the use of the electron spin rather than its charge. One of these is the magnetic disk drive. This is a technology 60 years old, but still stores 70% of all digital data that makes possible today's modern world of digital information. And this disk drive, some of the work I did in 1989 to 1991, made possible the ability to increase the storage capacity of magnetic disk drives by about 10,000 times. However, in the last few years, the possibility of increasing further the capacity of magnetic disk drives is limited by the size of the magnetic domains that can no longer be shrunk because of thermal fluctuations will upset their magnetization. Now, another spintronic technologies, which I and some colleagues proposed in 1995, it took till 2019 before that technology evolved with new physics along the way to enable the possibility of a non-volatile magnetic random access memory. And the reason why it's used today is because it can be scaled to smaller dimensions than embedded DRAM. And so this has become an important technology in the last couple of years. I don't want to talk about these ones. I want to talk a little bit about magnetic racetrack memory. It's another spintronic technology that I proposed in 2002, but IBM wouldn't let me talk about it till a few years later. And it took even further till 2008 when we demonstrated that the fundamental concept that makes it possible was actually true in reality in a paper in Science. And the basic concept of magnetic racetrack memory is, unlike all other memories today, we move the information around in order to bring the digital information to reading and writing devices. And we move it around not by moving atoms, which tends to lead to problems of stability and longevity. We move it by simply rotating magnetic spins. And we do that by using a phenomenon of current. When the current is spin polarized, it carries spin angular momentum, and we could use this to manipulate, in particular, the domain walls that you could see in this cartoon. If I go backwards again, then you can see here in this magnetic racetrack, and I'm going to show you briefly, we've now reduced the size of these racetracks to approximately 50 nanometers in diameter. These are domain walls which are approximately 6 nanometers in width, and by passing current pulses, the concept is that all of these domain walls will move in the same direction, and today at speeds exceeding a few kilometers per second, to reading and writing devices incorporated into the racetrack. So the same area of silicon that, let's say you have a capacitor, 1 bit, we can store 100 bits. This means we can increase the capacity of conventional memories 100 times. And actually, compared to a magnetic disk drive, we would exceed the capacity, but we would use 100 times less energy, and it would be 1,000,000 times faster. So this, I think with the work we've done recently, makes this possible. And I'm not going to discuss this, but over the last few years, we've demonstrated through really a lot of experimentation, ourselves and other groups around the world, that Racetrack is actually even more interesting than when I proposed it 10 years ago, because we can move the same domain walls at least 10 times more efficiently than was possible 10 years ago with the physics known at that time, in fact 5 years ago. And so we've gone through several evolutions of these racetracks, all of which are formed from atomically engineered magnetic multilayers, each with layers in the range of 1 to 3 angstroms thick. We can make these using standard sputtering systems compatible with mass production. So this is what makes possible Racetrack actually is this device we invented, we published in 2015, which is a synthetic anti-ferromagnetic racetrack. All magnetic elements have poles. The magnetic poles, just like a small magnet, have long-range magnetic dipole fields. They give rise to interactions. Sometimes this gives rise to very interesting properties, sometimes not. And in particular in Racetrack, the dipole fields will interact from one racetrack to the other and impede the motion of these domain walls. So you have to make them disappear. So I invented, actually, in 1990, this concept of a synthetic antiferromagnetic racetrack. You simply take 2 magnetic layers, shown here as this red and blue, separated by this, in this case, ultra-thin layer of ruthenium. It's about 7 angstroms thick. It gives rise to a strong antiferromagnetic coupling because ruthenium displays long-range oscillatory spin density waves, which I discovered again in 1990. And this is the fundamental basis. Now, these domain walls in these racetracks, the ones that are most interesting, are formed in materials which are chiral. And the chirality here is by breaking the symmetry, one of the magnetic layers is coupled with a heavy metal like platinum, and that heavy metal layer gives rise at that interface, so-called vector exchange, a Dzyaloshinskii-Moriya exchange, which causes these domain walls to be Néel-like and chiral. And this is the only reason why all these domain walls then move in the same direction when we generate spin currents by passing a current through that same heavy metal layer. The charge current is converted to a spin current that's orthogonal to that charge current through something called the spin Hall effect. And again, I'm not going to discuss that, but this is the essential essence of the racetrack. And in this device, as we showed, you can move the domain walls at speeds of more than 1,000 meters per second. Now, this shows you an optical image of the moving domain walls. They're static images. We apply current pulses. We then take another static image using Kerr microscopy, and we can see the domain walls moving here at 1,000 meters per second. So I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I did want to mention that over the last 3 years, actually with support from Samsung, just like Judith, we've developed new ways of detecting these domain walls. We use now the anomalous Hall effect. Here is a cartoon, a racetrack, and you can see these are fins made from platinum. And we can make any number of these we wish, and we simply measure the Hall effect generated by the magnetization in the synthetic antiferromagnetic racetrack. And then we use high-speed probes up to 26 gigahertz to detect their motion, to detect these Hall signals. And I don't want to discuss this in detail, but I just want to show you that we can actually then detect the position of domain walls along these racetracks to a precision of about 10 nanometers. And this just shows you a series of domain walls which have been positioned at the position of these fins. And you can see that they're 100 nanometers apart, and we can basically determine their position to an accuracy of about 10 nanometers. This shows it's possible to really use this in a technological manner. And we've done this in racetracks down to 50 nanometers in width. So this demonstrates the possibility of using this for racetrack memory. But I also wanted to show you that there's another memory which I think is more accessible, which is we make a racetrack here with one domain wall. We move the domain wall backwards and forwards using current pulses, and we detect the domain wall using an integrated magnetic tunneling junction, which is designed so it doesn't interfere with the motion of the domain walls. So we've now integrated this down to, in this case, 200 nanometers wide, with tunneling magnetoresistance simply as a device whose resistance depends on the configuration of the magnetic elements. And in this case, the change in resistance when the magnetization in the racetrack is up or down is about 100%. And now we've demonstrated then, you can see here, we're detecting the motion of this single domain wall from one side to the other side. And you can see we can easily determine these positions of the domain wall. And in fact, we can do this within 500 picoseconds. So this is fantastic, really. We've demonstrated now the possibility of a fully functional single domain wall racetrack for the first time at dimensions which are completely compatible with wide-scale manufacturing, with speeds which exceed the speed of today's static random access memory, which is the fastest memory. But this racetrack element will occupy a space on a silicon wafer perhaps 10 to 100 times less than today's static random access memory. Therefore, we could incorporate large amounts of this single domain wall racetrack, and we would vastly improve the performance of today's computing systems. So I think this is a very important milestone. And now, basically, I feel that this, with maybe $100 million, we could demonstrate this as a real technology. So really on the way. I think this I think is will be the third generation of spintronic memories. I must admit, I invented all of them, that will truly have a major impact. And I think this is fantastic. Anyway, I want to talk about something a little bit different in the rest of my talk, and this is this manipulation of magnetization. And so in the last maybe 5 years, there's been considerable interest in chiral antiferromagnetic materials. And what does it mean? It means you're probably all familiar with Kagome lattices, Kagome ferromagnets. Well, there are Kagome antiferromagnets. So basically, if you look at this cartoon, you can see the black dots represent manganese. It's an hexagonal lattice, but you see holes, and in those holes, you have tin. So not all the sites are occupied by manganese. Some of them are occupied by tin. And now it turns out that in this structure, the moments are in the plane, but because of frustration, then the moments will be oriented along these 120 degrees in a chiral fashion. Even though this is a centrosymmetric crystal structure, there is a vector exchange, the same one I mentioned earlier at the interface between platinum and cobalt, gives rise to basically a direction, a chirality associated with how the magnetizations are formed. And it turns out there's also a weak anisotropy in the system, so that these manganese moments that point towards a tin have a favored direction. And this means that there's a small imbalance in these moments. So there's a tiny net moment per formula unit. Otherwise, it would be zero. Now, there are other chiral Kagome antiferromagnets, for example, manganese 3 iridium, which is face-center cubic. This is hexagonal, in which there is no net moment and it's perfectly balanced. So this is a perfect system. It has no moment. So for racetrack, could be great. However, how do you detect these moments? Very difficult. However, two very interesting papers, one by Jürgen Kübler and Claudia Felser, and one by Alan MacDonald and Hua Chen and his Alan's collaborators. And Alan was the first this group was the first to predict the chiral antiferromagnets. He looked at the manganese 3 iridium. There's no moment at all, should display an anomalous Hall effect. We all know that the anomalous Hall effect is found in magnetic systems with a net magnetization. It's an age old, it was discovered soon after the original Hall effect. And the magnitude of the signal in the magnetic system is proportional to the net magnetic magnetization of the anomalous Hall signal. Here, the magnetization is zero. Nevertheless, one sees an anomalous Hall signal. It was predicted theoretically in the case of Alan MacDonald in manganese 3 iridium, the cubic systems, and in the case of Jürgen Kübler and Claudia in the hexagonal Kagome systems, which I'm discussing. And I don't want to go into any details, but they predicted in both cases that you only see an anomalous Hall signal when the current flows perpendicular to the Kagome plane. And it turns out that's difficult experimentally. However, we were one of the first to demonstrate that this theoretical prediction was correct. Using single crystals of manganese 3 germanium from Claudia's group, we were able to show, indeed, we see, this just shows you there's a tiny, tiny magnetic moment, and then this foil shows you, yes, we do see an anomalous Hall signal. And because of that tiny magnetic moment, applying a field enables us to change the orientation of the magnetic moments without changing their chirality. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. And you see a very large Hall signal when the current flows perpendicular to the Kagome plane in this manganese-3 germanium system, so as theoretically predicted. Now we go back to manganese-3 iridium, the prediction from Alan MacDonald, then we and others have not seen any anomalous Hall signal. However, what we showed was that, and I believe, this is because we cannot set the system into a single antiferromagnetic domain. Nevertheless, I predicted, we should see a spin Hall effect. And indeed, because that, it turns out, the sign of the spin Hall signal has a different dependence on the magnetic configuration. And when the anomalous Hall signal, through this effect, it actually is derived from Berry curvature, which I don't want to discuss, changes sign, the spin Hall effect does not. And that's a very important point. So we can see giant spin Hall signals in this system I'm not going to discuss. So what I want to talk about is switching. And so we spent some time on this, and we were scooped by this group in Japan who showed in this paper in Nature, very nice paper, that they argued that they could switch the state of the chiral Kagome antiferromagnet by passing current into the system. And I don't want to discuss their results. Their point is that they showed, they claimed really, it could be switched even when the thickness of this Kagome material, the thin film that they made, is way beyond the spin diffusion length. They're switching it by coupling a thin film of this system with a heavy metal, platinum or tungsten. And then you pass a current through those heavy metals, through the spin Hall effect, generates a spin current, it diffuses into this material, and they argued, oh, that could switch enormously thick layers beyond spin diffusion lengths. Now, we had similar data at the time. We hadn't written a paper because we didn't think that was correct. And so I want to briefly discuss this. So if we look, this is some work by Birger Goebel and Ingrid Mettig's group. He can calculate then the energy of the chiral structure as a function of rotation of the whole spin lattice in the Kagome plane. And because it's hexagonal, there are 6 equivalent directions of the structure which have the same energy, and there are 6 intermediate angles where the energy is increased. And it turns out when we apply current and you apply torques on this system, the torques will convert the structure from one of these low energy configurations, will convert it to a high energy configuration. So when you remove the current, the configuration, if it's exactly at that peak, it can go into one direction or the other direction, and you end up basically with a demagnetized system. So you have to do something else. The only way to set the state is to also apply an in-plane magnetic field at the same time. And this is the point. But that magnetic field you apply can be much smaller than the large magnetic field I mentioned earlier could, through this residual moment, switch the state by 180 degrees. So that's the little background. You have to remember then that we have these 6 equivalent states, 6 equivalent high energy states, and I want to show you what happens. First, just mention, well, the quality of the films we grow by sputtering is very good, but when we have to grow these films, with the Kagome plane perpendicular to the layer, so that when we pass current, we can detect a Hall signal. And so it turns out that's not so easy, and it turns out the films are textured. You have Kagome planes perpendicular to the substrate. We here use the R face of sapphire, but we have multiple of these domains. If we grow the Kagome plane on C-oriented sapphire, the 0001, we can grow perfect epitaxial single crystal structures. So that's the background to the structure. So we've extensively characterized these structures, and as I said, it's if you like, they're crystalline textured with the Kagome planes all perpendicular, but they're not all oriented in a single crystal. So what do we do? Then here's our cartoon of our structures, which have crystalline domains. And in this case, by applying a magnetic field of the order of 1 Tesla, you can see the anomalous Hall signal that we measure in this device by passing current, again, perpendicular to the Kagome plane, by having the Kagome planes perpendicular to our substrate. we can switch the anomalous Hall signal from positive to negative. And I want you to remember the change, the magnitude in the change. It's changing here, you can see, from 60 to minus 60 in whatever units these are. So what happens now when we apply current? So we can apply current, shown this 10 to the 11 amps per square meter. And what do you see? If we apply current pulse, wait, and then detect with a smaller current the anomalous Hall signal, we can see that we've switched it from this value to this value, but the change, you can see, is only 20 to 20, not 60 to 60. So it's incomplete. And I want to show you this later. We can actually access a whole range of different values of this anomalous Hall signal. Now, at the same time, then Berger carried out a theoretical calculation using the Hamiltonian I mentioned earlier, Heisenberg exchange, Dzyaloshinskii-Moriya plus anisotropy, and then he calculated something like this. This is the angle. Now, I don't know if you remember, we had this angle in the plane where I said there were 6 equivalent positions. So he's looking at this change in this angle as a function of, in the absence of field, as a function of current. So he's calculating there is, you generate a spin current from the spin Hall effect in this, I didn't really say it, it's a layer of tungsten. We grow on top of this manganese-3 tin. The spin current diffuses into this material, applies spin torques because spin angular momentum is conserved and causes these moments to rotate in this fashion. It rotates from a low energy state to a high energy state in the absence of field. And so when it goes back, when you remove this current, it can go back to these 2 equivalent states. In fact, you end up then with no signal. That's the point. You have to apply a small in-plane magnetic field to bias the system in one direction or the other. And this is the idea then. You basically go from a low energy configuration to a high one. When in the absence of any symmetry, it will drop back 50% into either of these 2 domains that have opposite Hall signals. That's the idea. Okay, so we can do a different experiment. Instead of applying a current pulse, turning it off and detecting the change in state with a smaller current, we can, of course, use the same current pulse to measure the resistance or the Hall resistance of the device as we apply the current. And then you see that the curves are entirely different. Here, you can see on the left-hand side, nothing happens to this residual state until a critical current. On the right-hand side, you can see that as we apply these currents, clearly the anomalous Hall signal is changing, and this is actually a contribution from a longitudinal resistance, and we can see that the resistance increases until at some point the system changes its state. And this state, then you can see there's some dependence on this magnetic field, but the change in state is always at the same value of this Hall resistance. And I want to show you that here in more detail. So we can subtract the background curve in the absence of any magnetic field when there's no change from these experimental curves. And then you can basically see a change in Hall conductivity with current similar to the theoretical prediction. And what does it mean? It means at the transition, the critical current that causes this transition, actually the Hall signal goes to 0. And the reason for this is the system gets very hot. So it's actually heating up, which is why this resistance is increasing as we increase the current. So it turns out that we believe there's very significant contribution to the manipulation of this structure is heating through the same current pulse that is generating the spin current to manipulate it. This is what we find. And then we have various experiments on the left-hand side. We're changing this in-plane field, which we're applying to break the symmetry. And you always see that the change, where we see change in the state, always occurs at the same value of this resistance. And it's true as a function of temperature. This is more interesting. As we increase the temperature at which we carry out the experiments, you can see that the current needed is reduced, consistent with the concept that the current has to heat. So if you're closer to the ordering temperature, which is about 400 degrees Kelvin, you need less current, less heating. And that's what we find here. And similarly, you can see also if we change the length of the current pulse, it's on the millisecond timescale here, the shorter the length, the slightly more current we need, consistent again with heating. Everything here tells us basically this current, it's not just pure spin-orbit torque, spin current switching, heating plays a significant role. And of course we can measure independently just by applying temperature how the whole signal changes, and then we can confirm that we're seeing switching of the manipulation of the structure only when we exceed the ordering temperature of this structure. And then this just shows you this. We can also see, in contrast to conventional ferromagnetic switching, where the switching current clearly has to increase with the thickness of the ferromagnet, here we find actually the switching current density decreases with the thickness of the antiferromagnet. But if we look at the power, the power in the system, the power remains the same, which means that we're heating, and the heating of the device is really determined by cooling through the surface and through the interface. So again, it's all consistent with the notion that we have to heat up this system, and then we can just apply, as I mentioned, here, for example, a series of experiments. We switched from state A to B by applying a current pulse in the presence of a small field. In the absence of any field, we go to this demagnetized state with no Hall signal. And if we apply, put the field back, it switches again. If we apply rather a field in the perpendicular direction, in the Kagome plane, then it's 10 times smaller than the field required to switch. Nevertheless, that 10 times smaller field can, in the presence of current pulses, will give rise to switching. In all these cases then, basically the switching occurs only when the system gets hot. Now why is that? So we have a very simple concept. I call it seeded spin-orbit torque switching. So what happens is you apply here, for example, is this pink layer is platinum or tungsten. You convert charge current to spin current, flows into this very thick chiral Kagome lattice, and only the interface, this gray region, is influenced by the spin-orbit torques within a spin diffusion length. The rest of the system, nothing happens until it's heated above its ordering temperature. When it cools back down in the presence of a spin-orbit torque, then it will follow the interface layer. So it's seeded, the structure is seeded by that interface layer. So we believe this is a new mechanism for spin-orbit torques that hasn't previously been considered. And of course, you can easily imagine, if we turn off the current too quickly, then nothing will happen, because there will be no current torque whilst it's cooling. And we can check that by applying current pulses, where we change the rate at which the current is switched off. If we switch it off too quickly, we see no switching. So again, proven that it's temperature. If we switch it off slowly, comparable to the time scale of cooling, then we can switch the device. And then we can actually show very nicely that you see these green dots. These show that if we follow this recipe, applying very short nanosecond long current pulses with long fall off times, then we can get the same degree of switching at 10 nanoseconds as we get at milliseconds, the data that I showed you earlier. Okay, so that was this. So we believe then we've demonstrated that the mechanism for switching of these chiral antiferromagnets is distinct from the mechanism, pure spin-orbit torque mechanism that was originally proposed by this group in Japan. Rather, it's totally different. It's a combination largely of heating above the ordering temperature and cooling down by this seed layer in the film that is set by the spin-orbit torque itself. And actually, this is very interesting. It means we could use the same mechanism to switch very thick ferromagnetic films, which have a Curie temperature. We can tune the Curie temperature, the ordering temperature, so it's accessible with reasonable amounts of current. Then we could switch very thick layers, and that would be very useful technologically to create stable magnetic bits. Okay, so I just want to show you now, it's actually very interesting by combining the magnitude of the in-plane field as shown here. We vary it from a few Gauss to 1 Tesla. We can change the type, the magnitude of this anomalous Hall signal that we observe by switching with current. And in each case, the switching current is exactly the same because it's the heating of the device that is needed. But in each case, we can control then the degree of the antiferromagnetic chiral structure and the degree to which different of those 6 domains are configured. And then it shows you here, same thing. We get many different possible states by tuning the magnetic field and the current in this way. And so this is very interesting. Why is this interesting? I want to come back to in just one moment. And this I want to, if I still have a few minutes, I want to talk about another effect that we've recently discovered, which I'm very excited about. And I want to use these effects to build a racetrack that not operating at room temperature, but operates at 10 millikelvin. Well, you're all probably excited by concepts of quantum computing, but to support quantum computing using superconducting qubits, typically you need very low temperatures to get the long coherence times. You need cryogenic memory in order to set up the quantum computing bits and in order after they have performed their calculations to detect their state. Today there is no such memory that operates at low temperature. All conventional charge-based memories don't work, in principle, at low temperatures, nor does magnetic random access memory. In principle, racetrack memory is deterministic and will operate at low temperatures, but we want to go beyond racetrack memory. We want to use spin triplet supercurrents. So all of you know that nearly actually all superconducting systems known today, with one or two exceptions, have singlet superconducting Cooper pairs, where the Cooper pairs comprise two electrons with opposite momenta and opposite spin. No spin angular momentum. However, it's possible, and this has been, over the last relatively short period of time, been demonstrated that in systems with magnetism, inhomogeneous magnetization, and you proximatize that system by a conventional superconductor like niobium or niobium nitride, then you inject into that system triplet pairs where the spins in the pairs are parallel. Of course, they can be in S equals 1, 0, or -1 state. Nevertheless, they have the potential to carry spin angular momentum. And so I want to just briefly mention then, the same chiral antiferromagnet that I've been discussing actually has an inhomogeneous magnetic system. And we've recently demonstrated, the first time, that by injection from niobium, you can generate super proximity-induced Cooper pairs that are long-lived and will move over long distances. We published this just a few months ago in Nature Materials. But it's the same material, manganese-3 germanium. So these systems are super interesting for this possibility. And I also wanted to mention a novel effect that we've also just recently discovered, which we call the Josephson diode effect. Now it turns out this is a very hot topic that we believe were one of the first to demonstrate this effect. I want to briefly tell you what that is. But the idea is we want to use a totally new device where we'll use dissipationless triplet supercurrents both to write racetracks and then to move the domain walls. And we're going to read them, not using squids, but using this non-reciprocal Josephson diode effect. So I'm not sure how much time I have, but I'll just, first let me just show you this. This is what we plan to do. So I'm giving you our plans because we haven't done it yet. This is taken from a very nice review article in 2015 by Matthias Eschrich, and he shows that singlet superconducting Cooper pairs then, in the presence of inhomogeneous magnetization, this was originally proposed by Bergeret, will develop triplet current. Now you all know that in a conventional ferromagnet, singlet Cooper pairs, because of the exchange field opposite on the two directions, when injected into a ferromagnet, the singlet Cooper pairs survive only for 2 nanometers. The triplet pairs, on the other hand, survive for hundreds of nanometers, as we have shown here. So this is a racetrack. Well, it's actually manganese-3 germanium, and we inject through a niobium injector, and here's a niobium detector. Basically, we form a Josephson junction where the manganese-3 germanium, by proximity to the niobium, becomes superconducting, but in this very special way, it becomes superconducting by establishing triplet Cooper pairs. Now, of course, what we want to do, we want to control the state of these Cooper pairs, whether S1, 0, or -1, and the direction. I believe we can do this using these chiral systems, because the chirality sets a direction through Berry phase effects. This is what we want to do. We want to use this, set the phase, set the directions, and then demonstrate, which has never been demonstrated, that these triplet superpairs that carry, in principle, angular momentum can be used to manipulate magnetization. And there's nothing, almost nothing in the literature on this concept, which I think, though, is totally possible. There is, of course, work that shows that in superconductors, in the proximity of non-collinear magnetization, can establish triplet supercurrent pairs. And what is this Josephson-Dide effect? I just wanted my last foil. Well, this is very interesting. We've discovered if we have two niobium electrodes on top of a Dirac semimetal nickel ditelluride, then it turns out if we measure the critical supercurrent for current flowing from the left to the right, basically you get dissipationless flow until the current density is too big, then it becomes normal. That critical current is distinct for left-going and right-going current in this system. You can see here, right? This is the voltage versus current. So no voltage because it's dissipationless and flowing at low voltage. When you exceed a certain voltage, then it becomes normal. But you see, the critical currents for left to right and right to left are significantly different. And this is because of a non-reciprocal effect. Origin still very poorly understood. In our case, we believe we've broken the symmetry through spin-polarized surface states, which are known to exist in nickel ditelluride, in which we've, with Néel Schroeter, who's a group leader in my institute, has demonstrated that we see at the surface spin-polarized surface states. So this should be a property common to nearly all Dirac semimetals, Waal semimetals, topological systems. So we think this actually will open a floodgate to new systems. And indeed, already in the literature in the last few months, numbers of papers, and we ourselves have even more interesting systems where we now see this non-reciprocal current flow. Why is it interesting? Well, of course, it means we could use this as a detector of magnetic field, because depending on the field, and you'll see it will be superconducting or not. So this is what we plan to do, and I just wanted to also finally mention, and this is the system in which we're making all these films, which it took several years to build. But basically here you can see this orange tube is a 15-meter long ultra-high vacuum tube. It's connected to several deposition systems designed for different techniques. So Judith in her talk mentioned pulsed laser deposition. So we indeed have a pulsed laser deposition system connected to this tube. We also have two molecular beam epitaxy systems, one designed for oxides, one for nitrides. And we also have our own homemade system, I call it Mango. It's 4 meters long, and in this system there are up to 44 sources, all of them behind gate valves. So we can change the material rapidly whilst the rest of the system and the tube is maintained at ultra-high vacuum. And this is completely automated. We've built it ourselves. This is totally built by ourselves and the tube, so we can automatically transfer substrates from one system to another to use the technique optimized for that particular layer. And so we have hundreds of possible choices. So to just summarize briefly, then I wanted to discuss in particular chiral antiferromagnets of recent interest. They display very unusual properties, even though they have zero moment. They display anomalous transport properties. And you could use these to detect their orientation. We've demonstrated what we believe is fundamentally a new mechanism of seeded spin-orbit torque. It's akin to exchange bias phenomena in antiferromagnets and ferromagnets. And I think this, I briefly mentioned racetrack memory. We've recently demonstrated 15 nanometer wide racetracks, domain walls moving at more than 1 kilometer per second in synthetic antiferromagnets. And now we're using anomalous Hall signals themselves. We can prove we can set the position of domain walls to an accuracy of 10 nanometers. And I just mentioned very briefly our most recent work on triplet superconductivity, which can be sustained at interfaces between inhomogeneous ferromagnets and superconductors. And of course, you're all welcome to come to visit us in Halle to prepare films as you wish. Okay. I want to thank you all for your attention.
Fantastic. Thank you, Stuart. And the breaking news has become a tradition at RACAM. The previous speaker talked about the spatial issue, and you presented some of the most recent results, so thank you. Any questions from the audience first? Yeah, one here and then Judy.
So thank you, Stuart, for a very nice talk. I have actually a question about the racetrack memory and specifically about the read-write operation. You went really fast for me, so I understood that you write it by passing a current. How do you read it, and is the read destructive?
Oh no, the read is, you read it actually, as I showed, in the one-domain Waal racetrack. We integrate it into the magnetic racetrack. You put an insulating layer on top, and on top of that a counter-magnetic electrode, and you effectively build a tunnel junction into the racetrack. So as the domain walls move under that insulating layer coupled to a reference layer, the reference layer is static. So the domain walls moving up and down, the magnetization goes up and down, and so they become parallel or anti-parallel to the reference electrode. And so the tunneling current that you would pass through that device would be high or low, depending upon the state of the domain in the racetrack. That's how you would read.
So it's destructive like a ferroelectric memory?
Not destructive.
Not destructive.
Totally non-destructive. You just,
Okay.
the domain walls are moved by current. They move. You don't destroy the domain walls. The data, the principle is they can be moved backwards and forwards without destructing them.
So a follow-up question: can you
Yeah.
have like let's say a partial read, like to create multi-states, like in an artificial synapse, for example?
Yes, you can do that.
Could it be adapted
Yeah.
for that?
It's totally possible. In fact, I didn't show that, but we've demonstrated that if you have a racetrack of some length
Yeah.
with a tunnel junction all the way across and a counter electrode, then depending upon how many domain walls and where the domain walls are, so in fact, we're very interested in building reservoirs of networks of racetrack elements of this type, and then we would allow them to interfere through long-range dipole fields. They would not be synthetic anymore. And then, in fact, you have coupled synaptic connections, if you like. I think this is super interesting, something
Very
we're working on.
Okay, thank you.
Wonderful talk ever, Stuart. I'm glad that you're not focusing on oxides. I'm glad you're not. Wonderful talk. I'm glad you're not focusing
we
on
are doing
oxides
some work on
too
oxides.
Too much. As I've always said, you shouldn't because
Yeah.
it's so complex. But
Yeah.
and so yes.
Well, for example, strontium iron 03, we're working on this. It's a chiral
Oh,
antiferromagnet.
yes.
Very
Okay, well,
interesting.
but very complex. But anyway,
Mhm.
your heat and seed process.
Yeah, heat and seed, yeah.
It's very nice.
Yeah.
But do you?
Uh-huh.
And then you talk about picojoule switching,
Mm-hmm.
but do you really get picojoule switching when you relying on this heating
Yes,
process?
it does. Yeah, because the element you're heating is so tiny, you don't need much power at all.
Okay.
Of course, this is the fundamental basis of phase
Okay.
change memory.
I see.
It turns out it's very energy efficient. The reason why that came and went, it was because of the unreliability.
Yeah.
Because then you rely on differential thermal expansion. Here it's going to be much less of an issue because we're heating to modest temperatures.
Okay.
There you had to heat to high temperatures. So
Okay.
all the ferroelectric memory, also because you switch atoms, also hasn't made it mainstream because of unreliability.
Yeah.
Otherwise it could be.
Okay. All right. That's great. Thank you.
So maybe I'll use my privilege for one quick question. So again, maybe it's my naivety speaking, but could you not consider the frustrated symmetry as an entangled state? And then, in principle, do quantum computing elements similar to transforms?
I mean, it's closely connected to spin liquids, and then spin liquids are a quantum state that people are super interested in. And I think it's, I think that's very interesting, but it's sort of these materials are, in a sense of measuring their properties in these ways is relatively new. So the domain walls in these chiral antiferromagnets are really unknown, their structure. And so possibly.
And one last question is, this racetrack is so beautiful, but do you have to read linearly? Could you not read longer elements similar to like a RNA replication? So you have...
Yes, indeed you can. So in fact, you're totally right. In principle, you could read multiple, you could lead a longer length of the racetrack to read multiple domains at the same time. And then this is actually... I think we haven't really gone, mostly we've been interested in the science proving that the physics works even when you're nanometers wide. How precisely can we position a domain wall? That's super important, and that they all move together synchronously backwards and forwards. We believe now we've demonstrated that at length scales that make it very interesting, so one can go beyond.
We're going to talk later, maybe that you could actually use holography or fluorescence microscopy underneath and make a much narrower magnetic element that you can read much faster.
Oh, very good. Let's talk about it. Fantastic. Okay.
Is there any online question do you see here? No? If not, let's first thank
Thank you.
Stu.
Thank you.